By the time the sirens turned onto County Road 317 and washed our gravel driveway in red and blue, my father, Walter Briggs, had already set 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table. He did that every morning at 5. One was his. One was for his best friend and neighbor, Randy Coulter, who had been showing up uninvited for a decade to talk weather and hay prices and who had earned a key to the mudroom by helping us rebuild a fence after an ice storm. The cups steamed, the dawn smelled like wet cedar, and the old Fox Farm fertilizer sign that Dad used as a windbreak clacked in the breeze like a slow metronome. Then boots hit the porch. Knuckles hammered the door. Dad opened it without asking who. Men in jackets said sheriff, and others in plain clothes did not say anything at all, and our kitchen swallowed a silence that tasted like pennies. I stood by the sink with a dish towel over my shoulder and a map of our west pasture in my hand, because Dad and I had planned to cut a new waterway around the pecan grove. Instead, they read him 4 charges that sounded like a foreign language on our own land: possession with intent, cultivation, conspiracy, environmental degradation. The last one hit me hard because it meant they had walked the furrows and seen drip lines where no drip lines were supposed to be, black spaghetti veining through the Johnson grass like veins in a sick calf. A deputy, a kid young enough to have mowed our yard a few summers back, would not look at Dad's face. He stared at the coffee cup that had been poured for Randy. Dad asked for a minute to put on his good boots. The sheriff waved at the clock. Dad moved slow, not stubborn, just careful, like a man measuring the edge of a cliff with his toes. He wore the scuffed brown pair he saved for funerals and courthouses, and once, for my mother's last Christmas at First Baptist. When they cuffed him, he did not fight. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student when the test is not fair, but the test is happening anyway. "Mason," he said, "water the calves at noon." It was such a Dad sentence that it made one of the men in the door swallow like he had eaten a nail. They walked him past the coffee cups. They walked him past the framed Polaroid of Dad and Randy grinning with catfish on the banks of Lake Texoma in 2016, sunburned on the same day they promised to take a second mortgage together if the hay barn ever collapsed. The door banged. The gravel scuffed. I wanted to run after the sheriff's Tahoe and pound on the window and scream that my father does not even smoke, that the wildest thing he drinks is root beer in a frosted mug at the diner on Thursdays, that he is allergic to the very idea of breaking rules written on paper. The search team spilled into the yard like bad weather. They moved straight toward the west pasture because they already knew. Somewhere, somebody had told them exactly where to look, and the wind carried the sound of plastic sheeting and the smell of a crop woven between our pecans, tucked into rows where we used to plant melons. It was almost surgical, the way they ignored our rusted tiller and went right for the hidden irrigation. Drip lines, battery timers, cheap motion cameras tucked in paint-chipped birdhouses. Off to the side, under a cedar, lay a coil of green garden hose I did not recognize. That hose had not belonged to us. That hose was Randy's favorite color. The sheriff came back from the field with his hat in his hands. He sighed, like he had told his own son that football dreams were over. "Walter," he said to the cloud of dust where my father's truck had gone, "I hate this for you more than you know." But he was not talking to my father. He was rehearsing something for later, something for cameras or the paper, something that sounded like regret but was built for print. Neighbors came to the edge of their property, the way cattle gather at a broken fence. Luann from 3 doors down held a casserole because she does that for everyone, even people under lights. Mr. Bell, who runs the feed store and knows every rumor before the rumor knows itself, leaned on his mailbox and met my eyes with a soft apology, the kind you give when you do not have a shovel big enough to dig someone out. At the far corner, under the live oak that straddles our lots, Randy appeared like he had climbed out of the ground. He wore a smile that had been practiced for barbecue lines and election days. He held up his palms and shook his head at me, as if to say, "Can you believe this nonsense, buddy?" I wanted to rip that expression off his face and staple it to a fence post as a warning to anyone who thought friendship was a kind of weather, blowing in and blowing out with no ledger kept. When they drove Dad away, I followed in my Ford, 2 trucks back, hands white on the wheel, the map of the west pasture still creased in my pocket like a warrant from another universe. The courthouse looked small against the spread of panhandle sky. In booking, I caught a glimpse of Dad through glass, his chin up, his eyes steady. He mouthed the words, "Call Earl." Earl had coached me in Little League and now wore a tie at a firm that had sued the county hospital twice and won. I called. I told Earl what they had said. I told Earl that there was a second coffee cup on the table and that there were drip lines where our melons should be, and that I had a neighbor named Randy who owned more lies than fence posts. Earl's voice turned into a pencil, scratching a yellow pad. "Bring me everything," he said. "Then bring me what you think is nothing." The first night without Dad in the house sounded like the hum inside a storm shelter. I walked the rooms and noticed small kindnesses he did without naming them. The way he folded the dish towel tight around the handle of the oven so it would not drop. The way he oiled the hinges every spring. The small brick he had placed behind the back door to keep the threshold from wearing down. I also noticed things that were not kind at all. Footprints on the side path from the west pasture that did not match my boots or Dad's. A strip of duct tape under the porch light with a brittle curl of wire attached. A tiny nail pushed into the mud near the fence line, smooth as a thumbtack, exactly where a trail camera could be anchored. Those were not ours. Those belonged to a man who had watched our habits and our faith for 10 years and had finally counted our trust as usable currency. I slept at the kitchen table with Dad's cup in front of me. I dreamed a siren that sang like a train, and in the dream the train pulled a freight of paper behind it, boxes of forms and affidavits, stacks of penalties, a long snake of rules written by lawmakers who had fought each other in marble buildings long before I was born. When I woke, the dream clung to me like sweat. It felt like instruction. If this was going to be a neighbor revenge story, then I would fight inside the language of paper. I would learn the difference between a county ordinance and a federal notice. I would measure our vengeance in letters certified with green cards and numbers that made bankers sit up straight. I would find that old coffee cup the sheriff had stared at, and I would keep it on the counter like a compass pointing toward the day we would pour something across a courtroom table that tasted like justice. Before sunrise, while on summer, I walked the fence line. I took photographs with dates burned into the corner. I traced the drip lines with a length of orange twine, marking where the plastic dove into soil, where it snaked around roots, where the timer box hid in a hollow I had once used to bury a dog. I collected a fallen birdhouse and pried it open, and a cheap camera tumbled out with a dead memory card inside that would not be dead for a data lab. I found a boot print on our side of the oak that matched the shallow heel of Randy's work boots that had walked our porch 1,000 times. I found a receipt wedged in the wire of our south gate, brittle with dew, from Hammerjack's Hardware, for 50 feet of drip tape and a timer, purchased with a card that had the last 4 digits I had seen on a cooler at Randy's 4th of July party when he took donations for fireworks. I tucked everything into a brown paper grocery bag like it was November, and I was gathering leaves for a kindergarten project. I wrote the date on the bag. I wrote the time I found each item on the back of a cereal box. I did not know what would matter. I only knew that one day, if I did this right, a man would sit under lights and answer for why he had seen my father's kindness as fertile ground. And when he tried to say that men do what they must, I would show him a coffee cup and a strip of wire and a receipt that spelled his name without any vowels of doubt. The day after the arrest, a patrol car rolled slow past our mailbox, and the deputy who had stared at Dad's cup tipped his brim at me like he had brought bad weather. I did not wave. I turned to the west pasture and squinted into the sun where the drip lines had been. In my hand, the brown paper bag felt heavier than it looked. In my chest, something steadied that had been rattled since the sirens. If the first part of our story was a fall, then the rest of it would be a climb. And the climb would happen on paper that made bankers and judges and insurance men clear their throats. Neighbor revenge, I told the wind, is going to look like certified mail. I started with a notebook because every American fight I have ever seen that actually finished well began with a ledger. The notebook was the kind a feed store gives away for buying 2 bags of mineral. On the first page, I wrote 4 headings that matched the 4 charges: possession with intent, cultivation, conspiracy, environmental degradation. Under each heading, I wrote the names of agencies and people who spent their days making those words either stick or fail to stick. Then I made a second list, not of laws but of systems: banks, insurers, taxmen, county fines. The men in dark jackets had chosen a criminal road. I would build parallel lanes out of civil penalties, administrative complaints, and regulatory pressure until the man who had set drip lines in our soil could not take a drink of water without paying interest. I met Earl at his office in a strip of brick next to a title company and a place that sold embroidery for church softball teams. Earl wore a tie that had flags on it and a face that could sell rain to a river. He had already pulled the probable cause affidavit. He tapped it with a chewed pen. "This reads like a neighbor guided them in," he said, which means the neighbor thinks he is invisible to the men with hats. Maybe he is invisible to them. He is not invisible to a judge in a civil courtroom, and he is never invisible to tax investigators. "Bring me your bag." We dumped everything on his desk: birdhouse camera, receipt, wire, twine map, photos with timestamps. Earl arranged them like a picnic that could end a life. He called a private data lab in Dallas about the memory beers and a forensic agronomist in Amarillo about the soil saturation around pecan roots. He was building a story that would say this was not wild growth, but planned agriculture. And planned agriculture requires purchasing and planning, and in America planning means a paper trail. I watched Earl's paralegal, a woman named Bernice with a laugh that could fill a barn and a filing method that could organize the Atlantic, begin a stack in a banker's box and label it Coulter Agricultural Incident. She wrote the date and placed the coffee cup I had brought from our kitchen on a shelf behind him, like an icon in a country cathedral. If this was going to be neighbor revenge, then the altar would be a courthouse table. The first letter I mailed went to the County Environmental Enforcement Office. The second went to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. I wrote about unpermitted irrigation, water theft, potential chemical runoff into a seasonal creek, and a violation of a conservation plan my father had signed in good faith years ago. I included photos and maps. I sent copies to Earl and copies to the sheriff because I wanted every man with a badge to feel the breath of another agency on his neck. The third letter went certified to Hammerjack's Hardware, requesting a copy of the purchase receipt tied to the card digits I had recorded. The manager called me within the hour. "That is a private matter," he said. Earl conference called him and quoted a section of the Texas Business and Commerce Code in a tone so friendly it felt like a front porch greeting. The manager decided it was not private after all. Bernice handed me a binder with tabs labeled federal, state, county, civil claims, insurance, banking, tax. Under federal, she had printed out a form for reporting suspected tax evasion related to unreported agricultural income. Under insurance, she had drafted a letter to any carrier listed on Randy's home and farm policy, notifying them of a potential unlawful enterprise on insured premises and requesting they preserve all claims communications, under rules that would become very uncomfortable for them if a regulator asked about spoliation. Under banking, she had collected the names of credit unions and small banks within 60 miles that were known to underwrite farm equipment and supplies on revolving lines. If a man purchased a fleet of drip timers, somebody had noticed the balance. At night, I drove slow past the live oak and counted the beats between the porch light coming on and a figure moving in Randy's window. I did not take pictures of his children. I did not play loud music. I did not carve words into his mailbox. I did not splash paint. This was not that script. I took notes on when work trucks arrived and when they left. I took note of license plates and wondered at the strange American poetry of numbers assigned to men in a system built to keep track. I wrote plate numbers on napkins and transferred them to Bernice's neat ledger in the morning. Bernice had a friend at a repossession company who owed her a favor from the days before she learned to organize saints and sinners. Carriers, she said, love knowing where collateral sleeps. I learned the smell of a courthouse hallway, printer toner and coffee, and the faint ghost of floor wax. I learned that a clerk can become a friend if you do not talk to her like a vending machine. I learned that investigators from one agency sometimes forget to call another agency until you remind them that their duties overlap like fence lines with a creek in the middle. I learned to say phrases that open doors like a pocket knife: public records, discovery, preservation notice, spoliation penalties, regulatory complaint, Consumer Protection Division, unfair claims handling, bad faith. When I said those words, men with rings on their fingers stopped moving paper and looked up as if a wind had shifted. They did not love me. They did not want to. But they kept my father's name in a different file than the one that ended with a mugshot on the front page. The sheriff called and asked to meet at the diner. He wanted to tell me how unfortunate it all was. He wanted to remind me that the initial charges had been dictated by what the men in plain clothes had found. He wanted me to lower my fire. I stirred my coffee and told him that I was not mad at the way he had followed the line on the ground. I was mad at the man who had drawn the line in our soil and then stepped back. I told him that I was going to invite federal eyes to a show that would make everyone sit straighter on their stools. He blanched at the word federal like it was a spice too hot for the county menu. Federal, I said again, as if I were seasoning a stew. Earl filed a civil suit that alleged trespass, conversion, nuisance, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He asked for injunctive relief and damages, and he stapled to it a motion to preserve evidence so thick it sounded like a dictionary when it hit the clerk's counter. He served Randy by certified mail and also by a man in a brown sports coat who handed over the envelope at the gas pump, while Randy filled a red plastic can for a mower that nobody would be mowing today. The man in the brown coat nodded like it was Sunday. When the memory card came back from the lab, it carried footage that would have made a deacon swear. Night walks through rows, hands adjusting timers, a flashlight beam trembling with the confidence of the unpunished. A face turned to the birdhouse hole once, and the face was not very shy about being Randy's. The lab dated the files and stamped them with hash values long enough to feel like scripture. Earl watched the footage with a stillness I had only ever seen in men about to harvest. He exhaled and said, "We are going to open 4 doors for the prosecutor to walk through, and we are going to refuse to hold them closed." He called the district attorney. He called the U.S. Attorney's office and used the words interstate, controlled substances, and agricultural equipment purchase records. He called a contact at the Department of Agriculture who wore a badge that could make small-town men forget their own zip code for a minute. A letter arrived for Randy from his insurer 2 weeks later. It said, "Reservation of rights," in a tone that translated into, "You might think we owe you a warm blanket, but we are holding the blanket in a closet while we call our lawyer." Another letter arrived from the tax office, marked with a code that promises a cold spring. Bernice smiled without humor and placed copies in the binder under insurance and tax. The county environmental officer drove his white Ford down the lane and walked our pecan grove with a clipboard, pointing and nodding and frowning in a way that meant fines were coming for whoever laid the plastic. He took a statement from me. He did not ask for my father's statement, because the rulebook said my father could let his lawyer talk. Instead, the officer asked me to describe where the hoses disappeared under the roots. I told him. He took pictures. He stood under the live oak and gazed toward Randy's place with a calm that had teeth. I sat at the kitchen table with Dad's cup and wrote one more list. Not a list of agencies or penalties, a list of names from 10 years of our lives. Men who had sat at this table and eaten our chili on cold nights after we had pulled calves in a sleet storm. Women who had brought pies and borrowed ladders. Kids who had learned to drive on our dirt lane. I drew a line through the name Randy, and I did not enjoy it. It felt like laying a rose on a grave dug in the wrong yard. But I did it. And then I wrote our names, Walter and Mason Briggs, at the top of the page without apology. I underlined them once. The house creaked like an old boat in a quiet harbor. My phone buzzed with a message from Earl that read, "Discovery responses due in 10 business days." I typed, "I will shovel until the blade hits bedrock." He wrote, "Good. Bring gloves." They say a revenge story becomes American when you can quantify the damage on a spreadsheet and still feel the blood rise when the judge looks over his glasses. They say neighbor revenge becomes real when the mailbox holds envelopes that make a man's insurance premium shiver. All I know is that on a Wednesday that smelled like rain, I watched an envelope addressed to Randall Coulter fall into his box from the hand of a carrier who did not know he was delivering the first swallow of a winter that would be paid in interest. By the time the first fine landed, the story had stretched so far past our fence that I could feel its hum in places where nobody knew our names. The environmental officer assessed damages for water diversion without permit, and suddenly the county ledger contained a column that had Randy's name in it and a figure that would blink red on any banker's dashboard. The tax office sent a friendly inquiry that was not friendly at all. The insurer sent 2 adjusters who walked his yard with polite frowns and took photographs of nothing in particular while seeing everything of consequence. And then something stranger happened, a ripple that has the flavor of conspiracy if you squint. A man from a federal office with an acronym so long it sounded like a secret society called Earl, and asked for a meeting at the courthouse because an unusual cluster of equipment purchases had pinged a database that is supposed to sleep until drug guys kick it awake. I sat across from the man in a room that had photographs of judges from the 1950s, looking like they had been carved from telephone poles. He asked questions that did not add up to curiosity. They added up to a map in his head. How wide were the rows? Did we see deliveries? Did we see trucks that did not belong? He said interstate and supply chain and the phrase structured purchases, which is a pretty way to say somebody was buying things under thresholds that invite questions. I thought about Randy buying drip tape, like a man buying scratch-off tickets at a gas station on different days at different counters. I thought about his red plastic gas can and his sports coat service at the pump. The man wrote notes that looked like straight fences, and then he shook my hand and told me that sometimes the air is full of threads, and all you have to do is pull one to see what is tied to your porch. The satire began, not because life turned funny, but because the players playing its seriousness were so earnestly ridiculous that humor grew like a weed through their polished floors. The insurance adjuster, a woman named Carla, with shoes that could step over a lie from 20 yards, asked Randy for a recorded statement. And he said yes because his pride was built like a badly rigged trampoline. He lied with the confidence of a sour. Confidence of a man who had performed 100 little tricks without applause and thought this was just another rehearsal. Carla asked if he had ever set foot on our property without permission. He said never. She asked if he had ever lent us equipment. He said no. She asked if he had a receipt from Hammerjack's because she loved that store and had an uncle who still welded hooks for their pegboards. He laughed and said that he paid cash. She smiled and slid across a copy of the receipt we had already pulled. His mouth made a shape like a balloon that had just remembered the laws of physics. Somewhere, deep in the halls where actuaries do whatever actuaries do, an algorithm twitched like a horse at a fly. The bank that held his truck note called him into a glass room with a ficus and a calendar of lighthouses. A man with hair so neat it looked laminated said the word covenant 3 times and the word default twice. And Randy started to understand that the friendly wind called leverage had shifted against his face. The county sent him a notice about a hearing on fines. The state sent a letter with a seal that promised hearings with microphones that squealed just enough to make a liar flinch. The federal office with the acronym wanted to know why there were so many parcels of drip tape heading to a county where melons had not done well since 2003. It began to feel like a ghost story written by clerks, 1,000 fingers of paper tapping on a window in the night. When I say fantasy, I do not mean dragons rode our fence line or that the live oak spoke in a baritone about justice. I mean that the scale of the machine we had awakened took on a mythic quality. Numbers animated themselves and walked into rooms. A debt sprouted legs and knocked on a door. A premium hopped into a pickup truck and drove itself straight into the ditch. At the diner, men who argued about bass boats started arguing about whether an insurer owes a man who has used his property as the stage for fraud. At church, women who know the price of milk down to the penny prayed that truth would be visible, even to the blind. And in my kitchen, the coffee cup we had kept as a compass reflected morning light, like a small invitation to keep going. Earl filed a motion to compel production of communications between Randy and any co-conspirators, and he stapled to it a list of phone numbers pulled from that birdhouse memory card. The list looked like a map of a spider's good week. The district attorney, who had been cautious because caution is a currency in a county race, called Earl and said that videotape will play into a jury like a hymn. The U.S. Attorney's Office asked for copies of everything, because when a case turns from a fence fight into a path for federal statutes, men with better ties schedule conference rooms and bring coffee that tastes like depositions. The agricultural expert from Amarillo wrote a report in which the words pattern and systematic appeared often enough to make the word accident blush. Randy tried to settle. He offered money that would have seemed like manna to a broke boy. Earl smiled like a kindly uncle and said, "We are not here to bargain with a canteen at mile 1. We are here to close the loop that a man tried to cinch around a good man's neck." He told Randy that any settlement would include a statement of facts read into the record and a stipulation that would sing in a courtroom. Randy said he would rather eat glass. Earl shrugged and said that courts require different diets than pride. My father came home on bond and sat at the table with his shoulders square and his eyes clear. He listened to the story of what we had set in motion and did not interrupt except once when I said the part about the federal office. He laughed without joy and said, "I used to think government came in 2 sizes, small and big. Turns out it comes in 1 size when a man puts a pipe in your pecan roots. It comes in the size of a stamp on a certified letter." "Neighbor Revenge," I said to him, "is going to end up sounding like a seminar for accountants." He said, "Good, let the numbers bite him where he keeps his pride." The day before the hearing on fines, I walked past the live oak and felt for the first time that the tree was on our side. That is the fantasy I allow myself. Not that wood grows a conscience, but That places remember. The wind pushed through the leaves the way a choir breathes right before a note, and I thought about all the mornings Randy had stood under this canopy and thrown his smile like a rope and walked across our borders with a tool in his hand and a plan in his pocket. I thought about the first pecan I cracked with my father under this tree when I was 8, when everything sweet came with a little work. I thought about walking into a courtroom with a binder that had more tabs than a hymn book. I thought about a judge looking down at a man who thinks paper is soft and learning that paper, under pressure, cuts. The courthouse smelled like dust and fluorescent light. A judge with a face like West Texas limestone listened to witnesses speak in the language of rows and valves and timers and receipts. The environmental officer testified about the drip lines that dove under the pecan roots like panicked snakes. The insurance adjuster testified about statements that did not hold air. The bank employee explained covenants and defaults in a voice so calm it felt like a lake. The agricultural expert laid photographs on a screen. The birdhouse video turned the air in the room into a thick syrup of embarrassment. My father sat straight. I sat beside him with the binder open to a tab called Facts, stated by paper. When the district attorney asked if my father had permission for any of it, the answer entered the record like a door being locked. And then the turn that makes stories stay with people who sit in living rooms in places where they do not know our road. The judge dismissed the criminal charges against my father with a frankness that undid a knot in my chest I had learned to live around. The order said words that will warm my hands forever. Lacked knowledge, no intent. Evidence supports trespass by third parties. When he pronounced it, there was no cheer. There was the sound of air re-entering lungs that had been storing fear like a bad habit. Then he turned to the civil case, and to the fines, and to the question of the man who had treated trust as a tool. Randy's lawyer said words that sounded expensive and hollow. He asked the court to consider a lifetime of friendship. He asked the court to consider community standards. He asked the court to pin the blame on a ghost crew of bad men who had used Randy's barn without his knowledge while he slept like a saint. The judge said the phrase weight of the evidence and the phrase credibility of the witness and the word sanctions. He assessed fines at the county level, ordered restitution for environmental remediation, and in a passage that would become a cautionary tale in 3 counties, referred certain findings to federal authorities with a request for review under statutes that make accountants sit up straight and ask for a second cup of coffee. Neighbor Revenge concluded without a single public screaming match, without a spray-painted mailbox, without a front yard circus. It concluded in the language of signatures and embossed seals and numbers that take a decade to pay off. It concluded with a lien that attached itself like a barnacle to anything Randy might try to sell beyond a lawn chair. It concluded with his insurer citing exclusions and reserving rights and finally declining coverage for intentional acts, which meant his defense would be paid out of the pocket where he kept his swagger. It concluded with a federal investigation that would not explode into television but would grind like a grain mill, turning pride and unreported income into a fine powder that could be measured against a statute. It concluded with my father's name cleared, not just on paper, but in those small ledgers people keep without admitting it, the ones that are written in the quiet of kitchens and the parking lots of feed stores. And then it did one more thing. It asked us what we wanted to feel now that the cliff had a rail. People think the end of a fight is a parade. Sometimes it is an empty room and a decision. Earl walked us to the courthouse steps and said we could seek criminal restitution and push for every dime until a man choked on his balance sheet. Or we could let the machine finish its lunch while we went home to plant melons again and ordered a new coffee cup that would never be poured for Randy. My father held the rail with both hands. He looked down the square at the flag that flapped over the war memorial. He said, "I have chewed on bitterness and it gives no meat. I want my name back. I want my land clean. I want my son to marry whoever will put up with him, and I want to sit in left field at his kids' ball games and argue about whether the umpire is blind." He paused. "And I want a check that hurts him once and a schedule that hurts him every month, but I do not want to hear his name in my house again." We settled the civil claims in a way that feels like a hymn sung in the right key. There was a stipulated statement of facts read into the record that said what it needed to say in a tone so plain it hurt. There was a payment that will buy pipe and seed and will also remind Randy every 30 days that paper has teeth. The fines stood. The lien lingered. The insurer wrote away with a file marked closed, declination for intentional act. The tax letter grew a second letter and then a third. The federal investigation did what federal investigations do, which is move at a speed that does not need applause. A reporter called 3 times. We did not speak to her because this story does not belong to the market that buys shame by the pound. In our kitchen, the second coffee cup left a circle on the shelf where it had sat like a little moon. I washed it, packed it in a box, wrote a date on the tape, and slid it to the back of the pantry. My father took a paintbrush and painted over the notch on the mudroom door where a key had once hung on a nail. He patched the hole and sanded it and painted it again. We walked to the west pasture with seed sacks over our shoulders. We cut the land's skin open, not to hide anything but to plant. We worked beside the live oak where the wind plays the same song whether a man is righteous or ruined. At night, I stood by the sink and thought about conspiracy, not the kind with lizard kings and satellites, but the small kind that makes a life. A conspiracy of right forms mailed to the right desks. A conspiracy of clerks who care. A conspiracy of honest men who do not turn their faces from clear evidence. I thought about satire, the way a man who thought friendship was his alibi discovered that friendship in a small American county is actually a ledger, and that ledger can be audited by neighbors who've had enough. I thought about fantasy, the way numbers can stand up and walk into a man's sleep and stand there counting until he begs for morning. And I thought about neighbor revenge, and how our version wore a suit and a badge and a calculator, how it knocked softly and carried forms in triplicate, how it measured its steps, how it did not gloat, how it left the room when the work was done. A letter arrived in early autumn, embossed with a seal that had eagles and stars. It said what we already felt in our bones. The investigation had concluded that certain activities had occurred in a manner inconsistent with a variety of statutes, and that certain remedies would follow. It did not print the word justice in large letters. It did not have to. My father held the letter like a book. He nodded once and placed it beneath the binder we had carried for months, like a shield. He poured 2 coffees out of habit. He placed one in front of me and one in front of the empty chair, and then he picked up the second cup and poured its contents into the sink. We listened to the sound of it hit steel. He washed the cup. He dried it. He put it away. The next morning, we were in the truck before dawn with melon seeds and tools and a thermos. The live oak waved at the sky, and the sky, which belongs to no one, kept its color. On County Road 317, a mail carrier drove by and lifted 2 fingers off the wheel, the way men around here do to say the whole paragraph of hello without moving their lips. We lifted 2 fingers back. Somewhere not too far away, a man woke to a calendar that had numbers circled in red. He woke to mail that had his full attention. He woke to a name that, if he is lucky, will one day be said in a prayer by a woman who loves him enough to stay. I do not wish him ruin past what the ledger demands. I wish him the clean, hard reckoning that makes a person decide to start over. That is not mercy for him. That is mercy for us. In the end, the land remembers the shape of the people who walk it. It remembers the weight of boots and the softness of bare feet after church. It remembers the bite of drip lines and the press of seeds that hope. My father and I pressed those seeds into rows and breathed out. We did not say the name. We did not have to. The wind said, neighbor revenge, and meant exactly what we had made it mean. Not spectacle, not fire, not a television ending, but a long, patient accounting that returned a man's dignity to his own hands and sent another man a bill with a line item called lesson.